Hi, this is Steve Mitchell. I want to talk to you a little bit today about some ideas about how and when Adam and Eve lived. I begin with, I want to make it very clear that I'm not an Old Testament scholar. I do not speak Hebrew. I I am not an anthropologist nor a biologist of any type. So we're going to have to look and see what some of the reports have and try to study a little bit with that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share screen and look at a video here. Move this, enlarge it just a little bit. I've got my Hawaiian shirt on, so it's kind of like being in the Garden of Eden. So we're going to talk a little bit about this. I mean, the Bible talks about um, two early people who were placed in paradise, and they were given just one simple restriction. And of course, they couldn't follow that instructions, and they didn't want to obey that one command, and that caused an awful lot of problems after that. So the question is, what do we do with some of these things? I mean, these have been iconic type of stories that are told in Sunday schools and Bible classes all around the world for thousands of years, and they're very, very important to us. The Sunday school told about where they were teaching about how God had created everything, including human beings, and how Adam was created, and then Eve was created, and there was a little boy named Johnny who was very interested in that. And they told him about how Eve was created out of one of Adam's ribs. Later on in the week, his mother noticed him laying down as though he was sick. And so she asked him, "Well, Johnny, what's the matter?" And little Johnny responded. He told her, "I have a pain in my side. I think I'm going to have a wife." "I have a wife. I'm glad she didn't come that way." But what do we do with those type of stories? Were Adam and Eve really people? How should we interpret the Bible story in relation to all of the scientific data and other ideas that are available to us? Christians are considering this in a lot of different ways. And in this post, we're going to talk about 5 different proposals that have come out that basically in the last 10 years. And actually, we'll look at 6 different books to examine these type of issues and look at some of the different views. Here are some of the questions which we're going to take a look at. They're key questions. Were Adam and Eve really physical people who lived at a particular period of time? There are many Christians that interpret the first chapters of Genesis as being the Hebrew origin stories that should not be taken as being historical in any real sense. Some would consider them to be allegories that were inspired in the sense that God meant them to teach us spiritual lessons, but not history, not science. Now, if we believe that the Bible intends more than this with actual historical significance, then we have to figure out how to incorporate it with other type of data as well. Genesis presents people as being originally designed to live in a world that was without sin, without rebellion from him. It presents us as being broken, people who are damaged because of rebellion with God. Now, if we're going to present this type of story to skeptics, then we have to face questions about what this looked like in our time and space. Now, if we interpret Adam and Eve as historical people, then there's a key question that is, when did they actually live? If we were to consider the genealogies from Genesis to be complete, and they were actually there intended to provide us a chronological timetable, then this would suggest that they lived around 6,000 years ago. But this assumption has been challenged many times, and certainly it's not the only option coming from a strictly biblical standpoint. Another important thing is, what about the theological implications of these options? I mean, Genesis is pretty fundamental to understanding how we relate to the world, how we relate to God. If the options impact our understanding of how we came to have that sinful nature that all humans seem to have, they influence strongly our view of the inerrancy of the Bible, our understanding of what the inspiration of the scripture really means, and that has to be impacted in this time. What about the image of God? How do we understand that if these were not historical people? What about scientific implications? You can't look at a skeleton and tell if that being actually held the image of God. Now, many people can look at the fossil record and they see this unbroken record of gradual change leading up to modern humans. Other people look at that same data and they see dramatic changes between the earlier hominids, the earlier beings, and modern humans. Is it possible that looking at the record in very different ways can actually give a better picture of how we originated and who we are? Another question is, do we have to all agree on this? I mean, Christians just disagree about a lot of different things. We disagree about how to govern our churches, baptism, the role of free will, and all kinds of things like that. Now, some things are critical for those who call themselves Christians to agree on. Now, these include the divinity of Christ, and that he was crucified for our sins, and that he rose from the dead. We must agree that God is the creator, but we do not have to agree on how he did it or when he did it. Those are the things that are more optional. So here's some of the books. Take a look at some books I've referred to. We'll look at these 6 different books that I've chosen and to reflect different views on Adam and Eve. And a lot more could be added. There are a lot of books available on these, but I found these particular ones very interesting and for the different type of ideas that they present. They were written over the course of 10 years. And these books bring insights from 2 Old Testament scholars, one being John Collins and another one, John Walton. It includes views by scientists, one that include an astronomer from Hugh Ross and a biochemist, Fazal Rana. There's a doctor and a scientist in Josh Swamidass, and then a philosopher, a Christian apologist, William Lane Craig. So there's a lot of different views on those, and we'll take a look at each of these in more detail. First of all, it's worth thinking about what some of the things that they do have in common. As Christians, they have some important things in common. And looking at the common ground, you would say that, okay, there's, first of all, they will all believe that the Bible presents Adam and Eve as historical people. Now, certainly I've read books that take them as being allegories, but all of these books certainly believe that the Old Testament and New Testament authors believed that Adam and Eve were historical figures, and that's the way they take them to be as well. They'd also recognize that the Bible considers all humans to be sinners, and this is related to, in biblical terms, to Adam and Eve. And third, none of these would believe that the science and the Bible are contradictory. Now, these authors may have different understandings of how this works, but they recognize that the Bible is not providing a scientific explanation for the origin of the earth or mankind, but nevertheless, they would say it is giving a true explanation. And these accounts that we'll look at have some differences. Does that mean that they're mutually exclusive? Does that mean that only one of these has a complete story in that? I think anyone who believes that they have the complete truth and can answer all questions and all objections is really fooling themselves. They really just don't understand the questions involved. Now, before delving into the books themselves, I think it's worth taking a quick look at the basic data that they have to reconcile. And I maintain that an explanation that will explain all of the data, both biblical and scientific, is more likely to be true and has more merit than those that cannot fit some of the data into them. So what type of data are we talking about? Well, first to look at the Bible. What does it tell us? Well, it tells us about Adam and Eve that they were specially created. Wow. Some conservative interpreters consider the details of the creation itself to be figurative. There's no getting around the fact that the Bible presents humans as being specially created by God. They spoke. Language is pretty rare in the animal kingdom, as in virtually non-existent except for humans. The Bible claims that man was created with that type of ability. Their children were engaged in agriculture of some kind. I mean, Cain and Abel were presented as being involved in agriculture. Now, it doesn't give us a lot of detail, so it did not have to look like farming from later periods. but it really doesn't sound like the picture of a hunter-gatherer that anthropologists have for early man. Now, also, it's very important that the biblical Adam and Eve had a very intimate relationship with God. God spoke to them and to Cain and to earlier people. Humans are defined by that spiritual dimension, that ability to relate with God. Maybe that's hard to find archaeologically, but it's still important. So think about that. What do we actually know about the mental and spiritual abilities of some of these pre-Adamic hominids? Okay, well, let's think about that. We'll think about some of the scientific data and what do we know about some of them. So from a scientific consensus and for where man comes, that consensus, of course, is not the same as data, but it is based on an interpretation of actual data. And most scientists would believe that humanity arose from a population of at least a few thousand. They recognize that all humans are connected. There is one human race. We don't have any populations that are higher or lower. Humans didn't evolve in different places, some of which were higher, some of which are lower. And one demonstration of this is the idea of a mitochondrial Eve or Y chromosomal Adam, and we'll talk more about that. But I think it's significant that there are potentially times where the population went really much smaller. It was drastically reduced. You've heard about major extinctions back in the past where lots like dinosaurs went extinct and this sort of thing. Well, this could have happened to Homo sapiens. And we'll take a look at when and what maybe some of the implications of that might be. I think it's very interesting that the studies of DNA and genetics science have confirmed that all of mankind is related, and it goes back a long, long way. Geneticists first recognized that all of humanity shares a single female ancestor, known as the mitochondrial Eve, and that name is not by accident, but it's not to say that they recognize this as being the biblical Eve, but there is still that single ancestor. And when they recognized that the chromosomes show that there was actually a single male ancestor, again, not believed to have been the biblical Adam, you look at the time frame of what they believe, when they believe these two individuals would have lived, like 200,000 years ago for Eve, 200 to 300,000 years ago for this Y chromosomal Adam, who has characteristics that all people have today based on being derived from this individual. It's worth recognizing that this estimate of age is quite uncertain, but the idea of a 6,000 year type of origin for these two is really just not in the range. But it's possible that there are some different interpretations of what this might have looked like. So now let's take a look at some of the fossils. And here we'll look at this. Anthropologists have discovered bones and artifacts from a lot of ancient beings, and these are known as hominids, and we're considered hominids as well. They're also called great apes. Well, at least we're in a great group if that's the case. So let's take a look at this chart, and what you have is millions of years going down, increasing as you go down, just like if you were drilling down through a whole bunch of rocks. The youngest rocks will be on the top and the oldest rocks down in the bottom. So it's going from 1 million years, 0, 1, down to 7 million years. In terms of geologic age, we're talking about Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene, and eventually up into the Holocene, which would be the time period where we live at, which began around 11,700 years ago. So we've got a whole bunch of different animals along this chart, and I've labeled on here Lucy, and Lucy was discovered in 1974, where these are the bones of a young female hominid dated as 3.2 million years old. And the chart is actually comes from Smithsonian Institute's Human Evolution website. And notice that they didn't show connections between the species, and the fossils really don't tell us exactly how they relate to one another. But on the other hand, this does take a step of interpretation, and there are changes in how this is interpreted with time. The age ranges are typically uncertain as well. For example, related to Lucy, there was another fossil from there. There's a key example from this Australopithecus africanus species that was originally dated to 2.6 million years ago, that in June of this year, they changed that date to be 3.4 to 3.7 million years ago. The general trend of the ages is very clear, but the details are subject to change that way. Now we'll take a look at when tools begin to appear. And we see those appearing a little over 3 million years ago, with more complex ones in between 2 to 3 million years ago in South Africa. Does that indicate that the makers were human? What about burials, when they begin to bury their dead? Does that mean that these were human beings? Well, we'll take a look at that in more detail in a little bit. How do we understand some of this? How do we approach an area where Christians disagree? Now, I want to advocate that we not immediately pick any one position and defend it, because if we lock in quickly on one answer, then we can be closed to other data. And there was a geologist, T.C. Chamberlain, and back in 1890 proposed a methodology which he called multiple working hypothesis. So the idea being that you list as many viable options as you can come up with and work them in parallel until some of them drop out. Geologists do this type of thing all the time. If you're planning an exploration or development program, then you're going to consider all possible outcomes, and eventually some will either fall away, but those that remain are still viable options. And so then you would have to assign subjectively some sort of probability to them and use that to help in making plans. So we can think about the possibilities for Adam and Eve just like this. And I'll show you an example. So we're going to start with Adam and Eve, and we're going to think of as many hypotheses as we can come up with. And I've listed 5. I haven't included a couple of other ones, but we're going to try to work those in parallel and then see if we can learn a little bit more on that. So let's take a look at some of these. So one hypothesis is that that Adam and Eve are allegorical, that they're not literal people. One problem with this idea is, okay, well, if I'm going to take them to be allegorical, when do I begin to have actual history? Is that a matter of opinion? Is there a solid criteria that you can use for this? Some would say, well, Genesis 1 through 11 are not to be taken literal. Why does it stop there? These are the type of questions that come up with that. Another hypothesis would be that Adam and Eve were created somewhere in the less than 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the relatively recent history, this recent Adam. And then the question comes, well, what about those humans that were around the world before that time, before 10,000 years ago? How do we understand them? Another hypothesis would be that they were the first Homo sapiens, so they would be maybe in the 100,000 to 250,000 years ago. But the question is, if they were Adam and Eve and they had agriculture, as the Bible says, where it's developed, why do we not find evidence of early culture in this? And then how do we understand the flood? How do we understand the people that did Noah's flood wipe out all of the people, when we know that there were peoples around the world fairly early? That becomes questions to begin to think about. Another option is perhaps Adam and Eve were created at a particular bottleneck, say in the 50 to 80,000 years ago range. But then you have to think about, well, how do we relate to the older fossils? And how do you transmit the information down to younger people? Interesting questions. We take that as Adam and Eve being created around 500,000 years ago. Well, one thing that does is that would mean that Neanderthals were human. Is that something that's theologically acceptable? That's an interesting question to think about. So we'll take a look at these. You notice I didn't put in here the idea that there were basically no Adam and Eve, and that's a hypothesis. But from my standpoint, that doesn't make sense, because I'm going to integrate the Bible and take that to be also giving us real information. And the other hypothesis I haven't put in here is the young Earth idea, which would say that the Earth is around 6,000 years ago and everything began at that point in time. But from my standpoint, not required by the Bible, and it's not supported by any data outside of that. So from my standpoint, that's not a viable hypothesis. So now let's take a look at these hypotheses in another type of view. One way to look at the hypothesis is to place them on a timeline. I'm a big fan of timelines. I think they're really important. Just like in a criminal investigation, the police try to create a timeline to see who has the opportunity to create the crime and to see if things actually make sense. Here we can take a look at these hypotheses on a timeline. And what we're going to look at is several of these. Obviously, if these are allegorical people, then that wouldn't be on here at all from that standpoint. If we're going to say, for instance, that they were created around 10,000 years ago, then that would be kind of over on the right on this. The time frame that you see of this is going from recent to 100,000 years ago, kind of expanded out, and then it shrunk down to 200,000 years ago, and then shrunk down even more to go out to 500,000 years ago. So we'll take a look at these type of hypotheses on that. And so if it was around 10,000 years ago or less in that time frame, then that would be the hypothesis 2 that we talked about. And if it was sometime near the start of Homo sapiens, then that may be 200,000 years ago, maybe earlier than that. Maybe the idea of it, if it's 500,000 years ago, that would be out to the far left. And then hypothesis 4 would be that there's some sort of a bottleneck which takes place. When might that have happened? Well, if I read from the Smithsonian's Human Evolution Research, their website, it says about 74,000 years ago, there was near extinction. Modern humans almost became extinct. As a result of extreme climate changes, the population may have been reduced to about 10,000 adults of reproductive age. Anyway, it's a very sharp drop. What was the cause of that might have been a volcanic event that's recorded off of Sumatra called the Toba volcanic event, and that's in Indonesia. So you can see Lake Toba is highlighted here, and it shows you out of that there was a huge cloud of dust. A lot of dust went into the air, and it caused a dramatic cooling, potentially a sort of a mini ice age type of a phenomena at that point. And may have been, at least one hypothesis, that this was what contributed to that population bottleneck. How far did it go? Did it go down below that 10,000? Or even so, was that a time when God may have started spiritual man? That's hypothesis 4. Hypothesis 5 would be to go back even farther, back to 500,000 years ago. And William Lane Craig will present his case that is when Adam and Eve might have lived. Interesting to note the size of this little bar on here represents kind of a very literal, no gap type of interpretation of the time frame between Adam and Noah, which using the Masoretic text would be around 656 years. So if that would be the time frame that you would have longer ones, but you see that it shows up as fairly small time frame in each of these hypotheses. So let's go a step beyond that. So now if we have these type of things, then we can start looking at, we add on some of the other type of discoveries that have been made. So let's take a look at a whole bunch of discoveries on this. So this is our same time frame. Some of the things which kind of involve the clearly spiritual domains, like early temples and early religions that way. discoveries in terms of music and art, technologies that are involved in architecture, or technologies that are involved in agriculture and other things, other discoveries. So we can take a look at those and see kind of where they are. And you'll notice that most of those discoveries are within the last 50,000 years. There are a few discoveries going back before that. But as we noted before, there are things like weapons, like spear points and things, which go back even before that. So now what I want to do is to begin talking about some of the different books. I did promise you that I was going to talk about some of these different books that are used, but I think this helps us kind of set the stage for what we're going to explain to that. So what we're going to use, first of all, we're going to look at the first book on this, was written by John Collins. And actually, the first exposure that I had to Dr. Collins was in a book he wrote on as a commentary of Genesis 1 through 4. But the next book was written in 2011. It's Did Adam and Eve Really Exist? Who are they and why you should care? Sounds like the type of topic that we're talking about. John Collins, he's got a strong background in Hebrew and other early type of ancient Near East materials. He also studied at MIT in terms of computer science and things, so he has some interest in other things as well. So his perspective on creation, I'm going to list these different type of characteristics. So for each of the books, we want to talk about what their overall perspective of creation is, what type of literary genre they think that the material is presented in, how do they relate to people outside of the garden, or if such people existed, what type of time frame that they might say, and some other distinctive type of comments. So for Dr. Collins, and his view on creation is that it's dealing with an analogical days. So the days are God's work days. Their length is neither specified nor important. Not everything in the account even needs to be taken as historically sequential. When he starts talking about the literary genre, which is important to consider for this, then he's going to say that in Genesis 1, you're dealing with an exalted prose narrative. It's not poetry. It's very popular for people to say that, oh, this is just some sort of poetry, and so therefore you shouldn't expect things to be literal in it. On the other hand, poems can carry literal data, but in this case, this is some sort of prose. It's not Hebrew poetry. And then Genesis 2 through 11 are basically given as prose. Were there people outside of the garden? Well, he says Genesis allows that, but it really doesn't comment on it. It can be argued that Eve really was the mother of all living. And as far as Neanderthals, other hominids, they're not mentioned in Genesis. No information given in them. And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind when we're studying this. Genesis only gives us a snapshot, just a pieces of information that it has, and that they chose to give, and we shouldn't try to force it to answer questions that it doesn't try to address. What kind of time frame? Well, it's not really specified, but it has to be early enough that for the early people to be sinners, because all people, it says, he would believe, are fallen. All people are descendants of Adam and Eve in that sense, particularly. Some of the distinctive things, he takes it as being a literary approach. And it says one of the things that we need to do is we need to cooperate with the text rather than forcing the text to try to address things that it doesn't mean to, force it into to address in our culture things. And questions we bring to it, we need to let it speak on its own terms. Let me show you some interesting things on that. He does have some interesting criteria which he gives for, did Adam and Eve really exist? How would we know? Well, the origin of the human race goes beyond mere natural processes. In other words, you have to have something beyond. Man is different, not just as a smarter ape, but he has something special about him. He has that mind that he has, and the ability to think symbolically, the ability to communicate, that is not simply a natural development of a previous thing. There has to be something mere beyond that. It has to be something which God has done, which actually changed them. And that's certainly what the Bible says, and he would say that that actually is consistent with what you begin to see in science as well. He would say that Adam and Eve in the biblical model were at the headwaters of the human race. Why? Because of that unified experience of mankind all over the globe, of having a mind, having that consciousness, having the capacity to be very good and very wonderful, but also that capacity for evil, and that all derives in a biblical sense from Adam and Eve. You'd also say that the fall, rebellion, took place both historically, morally, and it had to occur at the beginning of the human race. We have no evidence of humans who were not fallen. And he would say that if there were more humans than just Adam and Eve at the beginning, then you should envision these as being a single tribe, not groups spreading out, forming out around the world that way, but also coming out of a single tribe. An interesting way to take a look at that. So again, let's go back and look at the chart that we had, and we have all of these different things which we have found. And one of those is kind of interesting because in Romania, what we find is what is advertised as being the first murder victim. And this would be someone who lived around 33,000 years ago. So that would say that that's evidence that at least at that time, these were actually sinning. They were in rebellion. They were doing things that were evil. Now, there's probably lots of other type of things that you could use potentially to do this, but certainly most people recognize that murder is something which happened to those who have fallen. Those are since man was not designed to be murdering one another, but this is a result of the fall. Summarize his stuff that the Bible demands a historical Adam and Eve. He's uncertain about when they lived, but they were the first humans. And the Bible is silent about everything outside of the garden. All humans were affected by the fall, by Adam and Eve's sin, regardless of what specific explanations one might use for that. Okay, let's take a look at the next book, which I talked about, Doug. The next books are books by Reasons to Believe authors. First is Navigating Genesis by Hugh Ross. And then also in 2015, he worked with Fuz Rana, and they wrote a book called Who Was Adam? And these are interesting from that standpoint. These authors are, again, they're both PhD people. They have Dr. Ross is an astronomer by background, but he's done a lot of Christian apologetics. And Rana is a biochemist by training and has PhD in that and has a strong background in that. So they're speaking on terms that way, but they have been involved in Christian apologetics, and their organization, Reasons to Believe, is one of the most prominent of these, but it's from a perspective of creation. These are old earth creationists. They believe that the earth was created billions of years ago, but they believe that they believe in what's called soft concordism, which you really can't read right now. But soft concordism would be to say that you can correlate somewhat between the scientific history that we see in the data and also from the Bible, but you shouldn't need to force either of these. But you will find some agreements in those that are very telling. In terms of literary genre, they would take it basically as being a historical narrative, but they haven't used that or defined that specifically. As for human beings outside of the garden, no, didn't happen that way in their view. They would say that, but they do recognize that there were Neanderthals and some other hominids out there, and there was some interbreeding between them and humans. And that's kind of important because that says that, okay, there were creatures outside of the garden who had the ability to interbreed with Adam and Eve's seed as well. So that's an important connection. In terms of the time frame, officially, they would say somewhere between 10,000 to 100,000 years ago, and we'll take a look at more detail on that in some of the coming slides. In terms of some of the distinctive things they would say was they would take the general events of Genesis 2 through 4 are being as written, but the timing uncertain that way. They would believe in the special creation of Adam and Eve. They would say that all humans were descended from Adam and Eve alone. Again, there was some interbreeding, but basically there's a human connection. The human part is all from Adam and Eve. And they take Noah's flood as being universal in the sense that all of humanity perished in it, but not being global. So that would have to, it's important in terms of dating when Noah's flood would have had to take place, because in order to do that, you have to take all evidence of humanity into a small area in order to have that type of local flood as part of the explanation. Here's a couple of quotes on the timing that are significant in this. In 2005, Buzz Rana says, the reasons to believe model views Adam and Eve as being historical individuals, the first human beings who originated by God's miraculous intervention approximately 70,000 to 50,000 years ago. Adam and Eve's descendants formed a small initial population that eventually gave rise to all human population groups around the world. Okay, so 50 to 70,000 years ago, 2005. And they've stretched that a bit by 2016. Dr. Ross is saying that the most likely biblical date for the creation of Adam and Eve, therefore, would lie between 55,000 and 120,000 years ago. However, the date could be stretched back as far as 230,000 years ago. So there's a possibility of stretching that. So there's not a lot of detail that's available to us in that, and if you take this type of explanation. So if reasons to believe is giving us estimates of dates, then maybe we can take a look at those with my favorite tool, the timeline. So using my favorite tool, the timeline, here's a timeline that we've shown before. Take a look at what some of reasons to believe's estimates might look like on it. So if we were to take what Dr. Ross gave us as saying somewhere between 55 to 120,000 years ago, maybe as much as 230,000 years ago, that would be bars, sort of what we've got here. So it'd be stretching kind of from over a particular range. And you see that there are a lot of the discoveries that we see actually come after that time frame, and that's consistent with that idea that most of the cultural things would have happened after Adam and Eve lived. So we can't prove a soul or a spiritual dimension, particularly from looking at a fossil or looking at artifacts on that. But we can look for some sort of evidence for a faith or a religion. For instance, we can look for the oldest ornate burials. And it so happens in Russia, we have ornate burials around 33,000 years ago. Why would that be significant? I don't know if you've ever had to help with funeral arrangements, but imagine trying to do this without any form of language. I think that would be very difficult to do. That suggests that at least there was a language that was available to them. And there must have been some sort of reason why they were doing this ornate, and that suggests some sort of religious significance to it. You know, earlier burials could have been just to cover up the odor, because even elephants have been observed to bury their dead. So that doesn't mean that they're necessarily human, but whenever you start burying them in an ornate fashion, that suggests there was some sort of religious significance to it. Another thing we can look at is for evidence of painting, evidence of artwork and stuff. So we can go to France and we can look at Grotte Chauvet, and it's a spectacular example of cave art. There are many others, but I want to share a picture from this one, and you can see these are a set of cave drawings from Grotte Chauvet. They're in France. They're dated somewhere between 30 to 36,000 years ago, depending on what source you're looking for it. And to me, they show clear evidence of symbolic thinking. You know, the artist was drawing something that he was seeing, and it became a representative of what he was seeing. You know, most people would observe this, would say that the people who made this were certainly fully human. Now, we don't know why this particular graffiti was painted, but it may have been part of some sort of religious rite as well, suggesting some sort of spiritual basis. Another site that's interesting that we can take a look at comes from Botswana. It's listed as being the oldest ritual site at 70,000 years ago. What we have at the site are carvings and paintings from a long time ago. There are hundreds of spear points that were brought here and dedicated to a piece of quartzite that you see here, this long linear piece of quartzite. Some of the arrowheads and spearheads were brought here, as you can see in the picture. They were brought here from hundreds of kilometers away, and they were dedicated to this this stone, this long piece of quartzite that is shaped something like a snake, a python, such as would have been found in the region. And all of this suggests there's some sort of ritual behavior, some sort of religion. And so far, this seems to be the oldest documented religious site, demonstrating human behavior, Homo sapiens, who had a real spiritual dimension. Now, I don't doubt that there are other interpretations of the snake, but somehow this does indicate that there was some sort of ritual behavior taking place. And it was a long time ago, very early in the history. Now, this would be consistent with the reasons to believe model, suggesting that Homo sapiens were present in Botswana 70,000 years ago. The spiritual dimension and symbolic thinking is consistent with those people have been image bearers, the descendants of Adam and Eve. So let's go farther. Let's look at it. One question comes, how would we think about Noah's flood in this case? Because if we think of Noah's flood as being universal in the sense that all humanity would have perished in the flood except for Noah and his family, then we would let's look at the type of distribution of things. Now in this figure, there's a lot of fossils, the bones that have been found from human remains, and some of the archaeological sites. So I'm going to take the bones off. And here we will see just some of the archaeological sites that we've seen. We've got a case of the Botswana cave is down in here at 70,000 years ago, but there's a bone whistle that's found in here dated 45,000 years ago. Some question over whether it was from humans or from Neanderthals. There's an oldest jewelry report, and that's reported from 82,000 years ago. Does jewelry indicate that the ones who made it had to be human? I think you have to be some danger and some care in that, because just as many animals are attracted to shiny things and attracted to beautiful things, that doesn't necessarily make them human. And certainly if there were larger brained hominids, even though they're not human, they might have been capable of appreciating things and making some sort of form of jewelry, which is just a little beyond what we would see in other animals. The cave art that we talked about in France is here from Gros Chauvet. Our ornate burial is up in here 34,000 years ago. But interestingly enough, there's some pretty clear pig art that's over in Indonesia 45,000 years ago. And cave art in Australia as well, 28,000 years ago. So there's a lot of things that are spread out that way. I'm going to add on some of the other sites that have been found, where there's a number of different earlier Paleolithic grave sites that have been located. The murder victim that we talked about from Romania is located here. So let's think about that. You know, given the distribution of these findings, particularly in that kind of 25 to 70,000 years range, that would mean that the flood would have had to be before these sites were formed. And it's not clear how or when some of the migrations might have taken place to do this. What type of region did the flood cover? A lot of interesting questions come up. But of course, that assumes that the flood was universal in terms of all mankind. And some would say that that's not the case. A lot of possibilities come to fore in this case. So the books just kind of summarize the books that are written by Hugh Ross and Faz Rana present an old Earth model for Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were created as special creations, the sole progenitors of the human race. The conventional model with more literal interpretation doesn't necessarily really conflict with science, though the time must be a lot earlier than what a lot of people have believed. It had to be taking place quite early in that case. When did they happen? How did Moses know what to write? No doubt the Holy Spirit guided him, but what sources did he use? We don't know those type of questions, but they're interesting questions to consider when you're trying to evaluate this model. Now, the reasons to believe model would predict that future discoveries should make a distinction between image bearers and non-image bearers. In other words, there should be a point where you keep finding evidence of spiritual activity up to a particular point and then nothing before that point. And that would be where you might suggest that Adam and Eve lived. So now we're going to take a look at a different model. We're going to look at a book by John Walton. It's The Lost World of Adam and Eve, and look at some of his thoughts. And John Walton is an Old Testament scholar. He's a professor at Wheaton College. He's a former professor from the Moody Bible Institute. He specializes in ancient Near East backgrounds and from the Old Testament, and particularly for Genesis and the book of Job. So he's got a number of different things. So let's look at what his perspective is. Perspective overall, I don't know that he particularly says. I would take him to be in the camp in general for theistic evolution or evolutionary creation that way. But one thing is interesting about him from the standpoint of the literary genre stamp, he believes that this is particularly a functional account. In other words, this is not necessarily talking about material origins as much as it's being functions that are being assigned. Or the people outside of the Garden of Eden. He assumes that, but he doesn't necessarily specifically address that because from that standpoint, he would say that the Bible doesn't specifically address that. The time frame, he hasn't identified that, although I would suggest that in general, he would be talking about a more recent Adam and Eve. And we'll take a look. And we'll take a look at why. Again, some of the distinctive things from Dr. Walton's work are he's saying he believes that the creation accounts are functional origins, not material origins. He also takes the creation accounts from Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2 and 3 as being sequential. So they're recording two different events. First, God creates mankind, and then later he creates Adam and Eve. He takes Adam and Eve to be archetypes, not necessarily biologic progenitors. For archetypes, he would be saying that these are representatives that embodied all others in the group. He thinks that the Garden of Eden is an ancient Near East motif for a sacred space. It was sort of a way of describing a temple, a very holy place. These are very interesting points, and his views are, I don't disagree with some of his specifics, but I wonder if they're telling us the whole story. So let's take a look in a little more detail on that. We'll use a couple of quotes from Dr. Walton. This is actually from an earlier book. In my view, Adam and Eve are historical figures, real people in a real place. Nevertheless, I'm persuaded that the biblical text is more interested in them as archetypical figures who represent all of humanity. This is particularly true in the account of Genesis 2 about their formation. I contend that the formation accounts are not addressing their material formation as biological specimens, but they are addressing the forming of all humanity. We are all formed out of the dust, and we are all gendered halves. If this is true, then Genesis 2 is not making claims about biological origins of humanity, and therefore the Bible should not be viewed as offering competing claims against science about origins. If this is true, Adam and Eve may or may not be the first humans or the parents of the entire human race. Such an archetypical focus is theologically viable and is well represented in the ancient Near East. Okay, another statement that he makes that's along the same line, again, here from the book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, says perhaps Genesis is telling us that God chose one pair from the rest of the early hominids for a very special, strange, and demanding vocation. This pair, call them Adam and Eve if you like, were to be the representatives of the whole human race, the ones in whom God purposes to make the whole world a place of delight and joy and order. Interesting opinion, and certainly there are points to that I would agree with. Let's take a look at some of the chapters of his book to kind of see what it is. See what he's saying. He titles his chapters in terms of a series of propositions. And the first proposition is that Genesis is an ancient document. An obvious fact, something we may tend to forget sometimes. We tend to bring our own modern prejudice, our own modern ideas, and try to impose them on this document, and that's something that's really not appropriate. Dr. Walton often points out that the Bible was written for us, but it wasn't written to us, and that's something we need to remember. In Proposition 2, he takes this point. He says, in the ancient world and Old Testament, creating focuses on establishing order by assigning roles and functions. That's what they meant by creating it to some extent, possibly. He's quite correct when he says in Proposition 6 that Adam is used in Genesis 1 through 5 in a variety of ways. Adam can be used. That word could be used to talk about mankind, men in general, as opposed to woman, and also in terms of a very specific individual whose personal name is given as Adam. It's been pointed out that Adam is a Hebrew word. If Adam and Eve lived much earlier, then they probably would not have been named Adam, but some sort of equivalent from whatever language they spoke. Proposition 11 says, though some of the biblical interest in Adam and Eve is archetypical, they are real people who existed in a real past. Some of the uses in the Bible, particularly when it talks about them as being the parents of others and lists them in a genealogy, it's talking about them and interpreting them as real people. Proposition 13, the garden was an ancient Near East motif for sacred space, and the trees are related to God as the source of life and wisdom. Again, it's the purpose in the description is not, he would take this as being something that is not particularly literal, but is using a motif to describe a holy place. Can it do both? Can it be both literal and be a description of a sacred space? Proposition 20 is it's not essential that all people are descended from Adam and Eve. Many would disagree with that, and I think I have problems with believing that as well. But this is certainly a position that he would take, and he has some defense. You'll notice that I'm giving you a lot of the different conclusions that people have done, but I have not tried to present all of the support for it that they have, or the specific objections that we would have to some of these points. And that takes a more detailed type of response, but it's certainly important. Let's take a look at what Dr. Walton's view might look like on the timeline that I've been talking about. I like timelines, but he hasn't been real specific. In general, he would probably be way over on the extreme right, something in the range of 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, to say that when this particular hominid might have become Adam and Eve, it might take that role. That would be their role and their responsibility. Given that he believes that Adam and Eve really were historical people and are not really related to earlier humans, most likely he would interpret them in that time frame. So he would be advocating for a recent Adam. And he's not alone. A number of people from a number of different vantage points take that same view, that Adam and Eve were created in. These become the first of the line which God might use to eventually redeem mankind by forming a children of Israel way back in a primordial past. I find a lot of Dr. Walton's points very useful and valid, but not exclusive. Yes, function was very important. Archetypes are indeed important points, and certainly Adam and Eve functioned as archetypes. But did that mean that the Israelites did not consider material origins? I find myself unable to believe that. I think that they were interested in both. Identifying the roles was very critical to them, but I think they had the same type of questions that people through all time have about where things originated. So let's kind of summarize some of his conclusions on that, Adam and Eve, and particularly Adam are important archetypes. They're used as roles representing mankind. God assigned the roles for mankind and for the animals and for nature from the Garden of Eden. And the temple as a sacred space has images from that Garden of Eden, the pomegranates and these type of things that were in Solomon's temple harken all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And while all of these things may be true, it may be a kind of a false dichotomy to say that Genesis does not describe material origins and the creation of Adam and Eve in a particular literal Garden of Eden. All of the things that he is saying, or at least most of the things that he's saying, can be quite true and still be true if there is a material origin for them. And the creation of the universe is materially described. Adam and Eve are materially described in a very literal place. Okay, we're going to take a look at another book. We're going to move to a book by Josh Swamidass. He is a doctor and a physician scientist. He has a website and organization called Peaceful Science, and I'm really drawn to the idea of us having less confrontational and name calling and looking for peaceful answers for this, as we can dialogue together and try to work towards better answers. You know, his research group uses artificial intelligence to ask scientific questions that form kind of at the intersection between medicine and chemistry and biology. And a lot of his thoughts have been very useful that way. Let's take a look at some of his perspective. He definitely takes the perspective of being a believer in evolution, but it's a theistic evolution. It's God creating using the tool of evolution in his mind. He doesn't specify what the literary genre is in Genesis. Were there people outside of the garden? He would say definitely there were. And again, this comes from the fact that he believes that there had to be a large population, or humans originated from not just one pair, but they had to originate from a lot. Or if you did have one pair, that pair had to be back millions of years ago. It's unclear when humans originated, so other species might be potentially human. He spends a lot of time talking about what are humans and the different options for this. He does propose that Adam and Eve could be created de novo. They could have been new creations in the 6,000 to 10,000 year range. So he's talking about a recent Adam, but an Adam and Eve which were created miraculously as a part of a larger population. Let's look at some of the distinctions from him. He points out very correctly that Genesis is really interested in genealogy, not genetics. They are interested in who were the forefathers in very literal terms, not particularly what was the genetic thing. Genetics was not a factor for Moses. Now, if Adam and Eve were created de novo 6,000 years ago, then they would have been the genealogical ancestors of everyone on earth by 0 AD, by the time of Christ. And he does a lot in discussing what it means to be human. He would point this out as one hypothesis. He doesn't say that this has to be the only answer, but has been ruled out by many people who have looked at it from an evolutionary creation standpoint, saying there could not have been an Adam and Eve created, such as is recorded in the Garden of Eden. And yet he says that is not true. His hypothesis would be consistent with mainstream science. There's no scientific proof or disproof that would be possible. He also takes a point that sin could have entered through Adam and Eve. So sin could have existed through a literal fall in the 6,000 to 10,000 years ago range. And that's very interesting. So let's continue. And this is a figure from the genealogical Adam. And so if you look at the bottom line, it's taking, I told you I like timelines, so it's a timeline. And this is thousands of years since a universal genealogical ancestor was born, perhaps an Adam and Eve. He shows different ways that it might have looked. So for instance, here, if there was notionally 10,000 years ago that there was a human population around, but then two individuals were created de novo. They had children that married into the existing population and populated the earth. If this happened, then about 3,000 years later, after Adam and Eve were created, then potentially everyone on earth would have had Adam and Eve in their family tree. Of course, where the people were added or were located would have mattered. What if they were somehow located in a more isolated area? And that might look at some of the other options there. And regardless, by about 5,000 years, Swamidass concludes that there is a point called the identical ancestor point. And from this point on, everyone before that would be either an ancestor of everyone or of no one. His point is that in just a few thousand years, an Adam and Eve that were created could be ancestors for everyone. Now, when that point had to be is more of a theological question than a genealogical question. When do we have to have that? Because if all humans are connected, all humans are sinners, then it becomes important as to when that point is. So let's go look forward. Let's look at our timeline that we have. So again, he would be saying Adam and Eve were created in that 6,000 to 10,000 years range. Then all of these people that which lived before this, actually, regardless of their species, they could potentially have been human, but potentially they were not sinners if that is the case. And we saw, for instance, that there was a murder victim in Romania, so that's problematic from that standpoint. But potentially God could have created Adam and Eve as Homo sapiens at any point in this, maybe 50,000 years ago, maybe 70,000 years ago. And then the people that come after that would all be universally connected and they would be sinners. Kind of summarize some of his point on that. Again, Adam and Eve could have been created a few thousand years ago and they would still be the genealogical ancestors of all alive. Genesis tells us nothing about what was happening outside of the garden. And that's very true. That there are many ways to define human. I take the view that at least from a biblical standpoint, human beings all had a spiritual dimension. They all had the ability to relate to God. Beings before that, whether they were Homo sapiens or Neanderthals or any type of hominid, they did not have that, at least as far as we know. If they did, that's not necessarily related to us. What we are responsible for is those that are related to us, what we have. The idea that men were not sinners until Adam and Eve, and to a recent age, would still seem very problematic to me. I go back to the murder victim in Romania as kind of a proof of that. That would be problematic for any recent Adam type of view. How do we understand the fall? How do we understand the significance of the fall? Okay, I'm going to look at the next view. And we're going to look at William Lane Craig's book, In the Quest of the Historical Adam, a biblical and scientific exploration. And Dr. Craig is a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, and he's a professor of philosophy at the Houston Baptist University. He's a well-known apologist, has had some great debates with several of the well-known atheists. He's authored or edited 40 different books. He's well known for bringing out the Kalam, our cosmological argument for God. It's a lot of good things he's done, and he's come in with this and researched it. And I think we have much to learn from what he has developed. He takes a view of theistic evolution or evolutionary creation. At least that's the point that he doesn't take exception to. In terms of literary genre, that's an important point for him. He takes the view that it is a mytho-history, and we're talking about now Genesis 1 through 11 from his standpoint. So this is a set of chronologically ordered, causally connected events and ordering in real time. And it says that the brief history that they relate may be a mythohistory that is not meant to be taken literally. That's going to be interesting, and we'll look at that in more detail. Were there people outside of the garden? Yes. There were non-human species, non-Homo sapien species that might have overlapped with us. And he would take the view that Neanderthals actually were human. They would have been image bearers, to put it in biblical terms. What's the time frame for his view? Well, he would say that because Neanderthals were human and the branch from an evolutionary standpoint between the Neanderthals and humans took place around 500,000 years ago, then that's when Adam and Eve had to have lived at least that long ago. He makes a number of good points. He also points out that the New Testament uses Adam archetypically and historically. Again, the Bible demands that they be considered as historical people. He talks about the ancient Near East in several ways, and he particularly points out that their people understood that phenomena did not necessarily correspond to reality. In other words, they described things sometimes in manners that were more mythical, but that does not mean that they actually believe that those type of things happened in reality. They were just descriptions. He makes the view that all humans came from a Homo heidelbergensis couple, and that would have been the Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve in the sense that they were the first human beings, the spiritual men. If you're interested in a critique of this, I think is fair and interesting. Marcel Rana has a critique of William Lane Craig's In the Quest of Adam and Eve. You can Google that and find that, and I think it's very interesting. It's fair. It takes a different standpoint, but it's not mean, and he recognizes a lot of valuable contributions that come from this book. Let's talk about that phrase that he says in terms of this being mythohistory. First of all, the definition of a myth. It says it's a sacred narrative explaining how the world and man came to be in their present form. Okay, in that sense, it's not saying whether it's true or false. Well, certainly Genesis gives us a myth if that's what the definition is. One problem with that is that's not how people understand the idea of myth. We are used to the idea that myths are not real. And I think it's problematic for people to try to understand this as being a myth in any form. Even if it's mythohistory, I think that the phrase is problematic for most people and is not a good choice. Looking at some of the characteristics that he gives for this, says, well, it's a linguistic composition. It's either oral or literary, so it could be written or oral. And it certainly is that. It's a narrative, a story with characters and a plot line. No problem with that. It's a sacred narrative. Yeah, it held religious significance in the culture in which it was embraced. And that's true enough. The traditional narrative, it was handed down over generations. That's true. It's been handed down for a long time. And it seeks to explain present realities by anchoring them in the prehistoric past. Okay, but were these true? Were these events, were those prehistoric things actually true? Gordon Wenham, in his commentary, would call this proto-history. And I think that's a better term than the idea of mythohistory. Interesting that William Lane Craig talks about a number of fantastic elements or unresolved issues that are present in Genesis. He talks about it, for instance, the 6-day creation, vegetarianism, the snake, a whole set of things which he would say are not completely resolved on this. And for instance, we can ask the question of where did Cain get his wife? Well, it's not that the author didn't recognize that was a question, but he chose not to resolve that. And does that mean that these are fantastic and not to be taken literally? That's another question. Becomes very important in this. We saw it in the views of Josh Swamidass as well. What do we use to determine what is human? Do we look at DNA? Do we look at tools, maybe the cranial capacity, the blood supply to that? I looked up on Wikipedia. It defines them. It says humans or Homo sapiens are the most abundant and widespread species of primates, characterized by bipedalism and large and complex brains. This enabled the development of advanced tools, culture, and language. So the fact that we have a bigger brain just makes us a bigger, smarter ape. And so therefore that's all the difference is. But I don't think that's true. Does anatomically human mean biblically human? A lot of interesting questions come. When did language develop? We talked about how Adam and Eve, I started at the first saying that Adam and Eve came with language. They came with a close relationship with God. That's things that's very difficult for us to see in archaeology, but very important in terms of recognizing that people were potentially biblical humans, that they were created in the image of God. Dr. Craig quotes from McBreedy and Brooks from 2000, and I quoted from the same thing whenever I wrote my book on kind of origins and trying to figure that out. It's interesting, some of the characteristics that they have. Well, so she says that humans are characterized by abstract thinking, by planning depth, behavioral, economical, and technological innovativeness, and symbolic behavior. Symbolic behavior is particularly significant to me. The ability to represent objects, people, and abstract concepts with arbitrary symbols, vocal or visual. That's what language is a series of symbols. And they can deify such symbols in cultural practice. When we see this type of thing, this seems to be a really important way to characterize human beings, at least from things that we might be able to find and look for evidence of. Faz Rana wrote an article that says, should chimpanzee behavior challenge human exceptionalism? And he lists a whole bunch of things that chimpanzees in the wild have been observed to do. They'll make spears to hunt. It's a 6-step manufacturing process. They can make tools. They can make stone tools even that way. They can use the tools to fish. They can do all kinds of things. And they also mourn their dead. Does that mean that chimpanzees should be considered human? Of course not. But the fact that hominids with a larger brain could do some things that chimpanzees couldn't do and take that farther along, does that mean that they were human? Not necessarily. So you have to be careful about that. But that symbolic type of behavior, we're looking for that image barrier, something that might separate them. Then particularly language, art, and religious type of significance is important. And we've already looked at the way when some of these developed. There are a number of other biblical issues which we could talk about. Cain and Abel, they had agriculture. They had murder. They had a lot of different things, and there apparently was a population with them and stuff. How did that happen? How did that work? Who were the Nephilim from Genesis 6? Those are interesting questions which relate to understanding when Adam and Eve lived. And they're questions which we don't have final answers to. Where did Moses get his information from? We don't know that. Did he get it from a direct revelation from God, or perhaps God directly revealed some of it to one of his ancestors, such as Abraham, or even people before that? We don't know that. And the Bible makes no claims in this regard, but there are things that we would certainly like to know whenever we try to figure out when did Adam and Eve live. The author recognized these issues, but he didn't resolve them. But even so, some have tried to make Genesis into this cobbled patchwork of people from a whole bunch of different sources. But that doesn't really work. That's not what happens. A very well crafted, very consistent type of thing, but it shows only what he chose, the information he chose to give. What does it specifically tell us about outside of the garden? Nothing. We can learn some things from other sources, from nature, but we don't get that information from the Bible. And how we apply that, we have to take great care in that. I'm going to go back to the kind of decision charts that I was showing, or the different options, and we'll think about how we developed that, how Adam and Eve formed. We had a number of different hypotheses that we made. We talked about them in terms of whether Adam and Eve were allegorical, whether there was a recent Adam less than 10,000 years ago, maybe much older, 100 to 250,000 years ago, maybe in the 50 to 80,000 years ago range, 500,000 years, lots of different options on those. We recognize that there are a series of questions on this. From my standpoint, these all have a certain amount of viability. They all have difficulties with them. So it becomes a matter of probability of which one is right. I'm going to give you my probability, but this is my subjective guess on that. And then I'll explain to you how I come about some of these type of numbers. So I'm going to say that there's just a 5% chance, in my point, from my perspective, my biblical studies, that we should take Adam and Eve as being allegorical or less literal type people. I'd say that some of the other ranges, maybe 15% chance that there was a recent Adam, 15% for a much older Adam, hypothesis 3 and 4 much closer. So how would we think through where we would get this? How might you think through where you think these type of numbers would fall in your view? Well, let's take a look at that. First of all, first question is, were Adam and Eve historical? So if they were, well, what would we do? Well, we think about, does the Old Testament consider Adam and Eve as historical people? Does the New Testament consider Adam and Eve as historical people? And does this impact the key doctrines of salvation? Do scientific discoveries rule out the origination from two people, or do science discoveries allow for the creation of an Adam and Eve later? If you believe and accept that, then you'll come up with might come from a different conclusion. So that's where, again, from my standpoint, personally, I think that the New Testament and Old Testament both demand a literal Adam and Eve, and that's very key to me. And I don't think the science tells us one way or the other. Okay, so we're going to go another step forward on that. Say is that there was a 5% chance that hypothesis 1 is true, that Adam and Eve are given in some sort of an allegory. They were not literal people, but something else, something less literal that way. But if we believe that there's a literal Adam and Eve, then there still are multiple opportunities, possibilities for that. So, for instance, well, they might be kind of divided into those which have a more recent Adam and Eve, which I would call hypothesis 2, or hypotheses 3 through 5, which would be opportunities or options for an earlier or more ancient Adam and Eve. So what kind of questions might we think about to decide which of these we hold to? Well, do we believe that Adam and Eve lived earlier than 10,000 years ago, or could have lived earlier than 10,000 years ago? Then that we're automatically in the hypotheses 3 to 5 bucket. Do the Genesis genealogies tell us when they lived? Okay, if the genealogies are telling you that, then they would say that it's sometime more recent than that, in the less than 10,000 year range. So that would tell us that we would believe perhaps hypothesis 2. Were Adam and Eve really at the headwaters of the human race, or were they something different, such as the start of Israel as God's plan to redeem fallen mankind? That kind of separates the two. Are all humans descended from Adam and Eve? Then that would tend to lend ourselves to something that's got to be into the 3 to 5 range. Did the fall of Adam and Eve bring sin to all mankind? Then If we see evidence of sin earlier, then that would say that Adam and Eve had to be earlier. Were all humans impacted by Noah's flood? That's an interesting question too, because if they were not, then you have great freedom in where to put him. But on the other hand, if they were impacted, then you have to say that where you place that flood makes a very big difference in terms of which hypothesis you would tend to go with. So again, I put my preferences on this would say that adding up all of these, you get 100%. But for the recent Adam and Eve, I would give that 15% because I'm less convinced by that. But then that would say that there would be an 80% chance of an older Adam and Eve. You may have a whole different idea on that. That's okay. Let's go forward then and break up hypothesis 3 to 5. So I've moved it down. Hypothesis 3 to 5 are coming up this way. So there's a total of 80% possible on that, but I would split that up in between these two. One would be the hypothesis that you have an early Adam and Eve, something more, but still more recent, or one that's older, which would be something that William Lane Craig would be proposing. A few questions that might help on this would be just thinking about how much of Genesis 1 through 11 should be interpreted as including historical information. The more that you put into that, I think the more recent you would tend to believe that Adam and Eve lived. Were Neanderthals image bearers? Because if they were image bearing humans, then that would put you in the 500,000 year range, which is where William Lane Craig is, saying that perhaps Adam and Eve would be considered Homo heidelbergensis, which would have been the species that then led to both Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals. Question still is interesting in terms of how did the stories originate? In other words, if they were carried down by traditions and stuff from near the time when things may have happened, then that would suggest an earlier Adam and Eve, but not in maybe perhaps in the 500,000 year range. Interesting questions. My preferences would be to say that there is a 15% chance perhaps that Adam and Eve lived in that 500,000 year range, but I'm less persuaded by that. So obviously I'm putting more emphasis on the hypotheses 3 and 4, but those are still different. So we need to continue. Let's take a look at some other options. So let's look at these. We're going to now split up the hypothesis 3 and 4 and move into these. So I'm going to have to move my picture down on the bottom here and say that this would say that perhaps hypothesis 3 would be that they were early, if not the first Homo sapiens in the 100,000 to 250,000 year range, still a long time ago. Perhaps a more recent option would be there, which would be hypothesis 4, which would say that they originated at a population bottleneck, perhaps in the 50 to 80,000 year ago range. So let's look at some questions that might be interesting to help you think through this. Again, the question might be, were all Homo sapiens image bearers? If that's true, then you might need to go back to earlier times, such as the 250,000 year range. Do archaeological discoveries help to show the image-bearing humans? Or when we begin to see technologies and spiritual emphasis in the archaeological discoveries, does that indicate that these were humans? And if we don't find them, is that suggesting that some of the Homo sapiens that might have lived earlier were not image bearers? When was Noah's flood? And did it affect all of mankind? And if it affected all of mankind and we decide we know approximately when it is, then that tells us a lot about when to put Adam and Eve. And again, how did the stories originate? The more recent time gives maybe an easier story to begin to say how they originated. But these stories could have come to us from visions or revelation to Moses or people before him and be not connected at all to that. And we simply don't know. Things to consider, and you can make up your own mind. from my standpoint, I tend to like the bottleneck view a little bit, but it's not a strong change. And that would give us all of these numbers, this 30, 35, 15, 15, and 5 would add up to 100%. So that would say that one of these options should be absolutely true. We just don't know which one, but I have a different ideas about the probability. And there are, to be honest, there probably are other options which you might want to consider, but it could be thought through as a very similar type of process to this. Thank you for bearing with me. This has been a very long talk, but as I've helped me to think through some of the issues, and hopefully it'll help you as well. Some of the conclusions I have with, well, again, Christians can disagree, and no one has that perfect answer, the one that answers all questions and has no difficulties to it. I find the multiple working hypothesis can help. Future discoveries and exegesis may help, but we'll probably still be left with uncertainty 100 years from now, should the Lord tarry. While there may be uncertainty about the details, multiple options exist to interpret how Adam and Eve may have looked in history. Many Christians find no conflict with a less historical interpretation, and while I do not agree, even if that were true, Christianity would still be true, and it's not a threat to our faith. Thank you for putting up with this. Bye-bye.